Welcome to Movie Rehab. Are you sane enough to escape the show? Like with my previous episode, I'm going to review another movie that wasn't too popular with most critics, but well loved from my side. Today's film is going to be Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Yes, I know, yet again another vampire flick, but don't worry people, we won't be dealing with any other bloodsuckers in the next episode. So, without further ado, it's time to dive in to this underrated silver medal worthy flick. You got a special kind of show, but some points that you never know. It's just points to be some changes in your mind. It's so profound and not that well, but not as much as we can tell, because you are the one who looks too far behind, with no kind. The movie begins with a narration from our title hero, played by Benjamin Walker. We also get this awesome transition shot of the Washington Monument. Seriously, just notice how the background scenery doesn't change this right away. It's subtly done, and it takes its time until it pans to the White House. I just love those small details. This then immediately cuts to Abe Lincoln, leaving his life journal to a man called Henry Sturgis, played by Dominic Cooper. This then leads to where the story truly begins. We see Abe Lincoln as a child, who witnesses how his friend's parents get taken away from him, despite them not being slaves. Said friend is William Johnson, who was Abe's personal valet in real life, while in this movie, they're childhood friends. This scene also partially establishes the tone of this movie because, based on the title, you would probably expect Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter to be purely comedic by nature, but that's not actually the case, as this film also features a lot of serious moments as well, which is something that I really like a lot about this movie, but you know what? I will elaborate on my reasons for that later on. Abe then tries to attack that ass who carries this whip, but he then eventually gets himself hurt as well. Abe's father then gets rid of that bastard. His boss, Jack Bartz, then arrives and tells him to go back to work. And even though Abe's family calls the asshole out for mistreating people who weren't even slaves to begin with, Bartz simply doesn't care.
Till every man is free, we are all slaves.
Abe's father then gets fired, which he couldn't care less for, as he's disgusted by the unfairness occurring at his former workplace. Later that night, our poor Abe witnesses how his mother gets bitten by Jack Bartz, which then leads to her suffering a slow and painful death. During the funeral, Abe gets told by his father to not do anything foolish. Several years later, his father dies as well, and thus Abe feels like he's not bound to his promise anymore.
Haven't you had enough? A boy only gets this drunk when he wants to kiss a girl or kill a man.
Abe then returns back to his father's former workplace to avenge his mother. We are then introduced to our villainous duo of this movie, Adam, played by Rufus Sewell, and his sister Vadoma, played by Aaron Wasson. After that talk, Abe then sneaks behind Bart's back, and even though he manages to shoot him in the forehead, it is then revealed that Bart is indeed a vampire. After locking himself inside a small cabin, he manages to shoot Bart in his right eye. Well, at least from my camera perspective. Abe then throws his gun away to get rid of any evidence. But much to his horror, he discovers that Bart is still biting. Thankfully, he gets saved by Henry. Abe then wakes up inside that guy's place, and then suddenly hears a woman screaming. Being the hero that he is, Abe decides to save her.
Might I suggest that we begin by closing the door?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't see anything.
You know, this is another moment that I like a lot, as it establishes the next tone of this flick. This movie can indeed be very serious, but there are still some quirky, good-natured moments here as well. It's not too over the top, and there's a light charm to it. The lady then leaves the place, but not before gazing over the looks of Abe, with her now probably thinking threesome.
Henry explains Abe that vampires are real and how Bart's is one of them. Abe then wants Henry to help him killing Bart's, but the latter doesn't care for his pleas.
And if I teach you how to murder her murderer, so what? How will that honor her memory? How will that benefit the next boy whose mother is taken? If vengeance is all you seek, seek it elsewhere.
I really like that line because Henry is actually right. Most people who are seeking for vengeance don't really seem to think through whether or not this act would heal their inner wounds, or if they're just trying to satisfy their lust for vengeance. Though, considering that Bart's is a murderous vampire, I think that Abe still has a pretty legit reason to kill that bastard. Abe then asks to learn how to become a vampire hunter. Henry then tells him that this job comes with the price of not having any friends, family, or loved ones in your life. Abe then pretends to follow Henry's conditions in order to accomplish his personal goal. Honest Abe my ass. And the weapon of choice ends up being an axe with a silver-covered blade. This then leads to a pretty sick montage. Henry then talks with Abe about the worst of the worst amongst the vampires' rogue gallery. The main vampires they've got to take care of are Adam and his sister Vadoma.
Vampires have been in the New World for centuries, slaughtering native tribes and early settlers. But when the Europeans arrived with their slaves, the dead saw a sinister opportunity. They built an empire in the south, but in recent years they pressed north, leaving death in their wake. It falls to us, Abraham, the hunters, to keep the balance, to ensure that this remains a nation of men.
The idea to combine the slavery topic with vampires at first sounds pretty questionable to some, but this movie actually manages to handle the subject matter pretty well. If this film was purely comedic, then the execution could have actually been far worse, because it would be way more difficult to combine both themes without coming off as in poor taste. Abe then moves to Springfield, Illinois, where he rents a room at a building where he gets to live in under the condition that he also works at this place. Said building is owned by Joshua Speed, played by Jimmy Simpson. No Simpsons jokes. Who he would also eventually befriend. That does, of course, kind of break the promise he gave to Henry, but hey, at least he's not falling in love.
I'm Abraham. Lincoln.
Never mind. We then get introduced to Mary Todd, played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead. The next person entering the room is Stephen A. Douglas, played by Alan Tudyk, who's channeling his inner seventh doctor, judging by this guy's clothing style. Douglas says that slavery is a very complicated subject matter to discuss, but Abe rightfully disagrees. Seriously, slavery can stay dead. Abe then receives a letter from Henry about his first vampire mission. He does end up getting captured, however, and much to his horror he has to realize that this bastard owns some sort of a slavery farm where those poor people get hung up like dead animals, the only difference being that they milk their blood instead of dairy products. Thankfully, Abe manages to win the upper hand, with him defeating the first one. As weeks and months have passed by, he would go out to kill a nice number of other vampires, thus becoming one hell of a badass. The killing in this movie is also pretty brutal, but more in a cartoonish way so that it doesn't end up being disturbing. Well, except for this part. But my point still stands. The fact that the vampire blood is black also makes perfect sense if you really think about it. Why? Well, that's because blood is related to the amount of oxygen bound to the red blood cells. The more oxygen in the blood, the brighter red it appears. As oxygenation of the blood gets lower, the blood gets darker and darker. Occasionally in certain lights, or if the oxygen level is very low, the blood can appear almost black. It also adds further reasons as to why vampires are so bloodthirsty in the first place, because can you imagine how refreshingly delicious the red blood of the living has to be to them? I certainly can. Back to the plot. Abe and Joshua get invited into a big great party, with the latter making fun of Abe's hat.
This suit makes me look ridiculous. Nonsense. But that hat makes me look ridiculous. Come on.
Joshua even tries to ship Abe with Mary Todd. Abe tries to avoid falling for her, but love always finds a way. They both have a sweet date at a beautiful looking pond at a park. Abe even confesses to her that he is in fact a vampire hunter, but she thinks that he's just joking around, which is pretty amusing considering that the truth he's telling sounds more like a lie than anything else.
I thought you were an honest man.
They both then return back to Mary's place, and even though it looks like they're both about to have their big damn kiss, he still tries to avoid emotional bonding and lets her kiss his cheek instead. Which is still a pretty cute moment nonetheless. Abe then reunites with his old childhood friend William Johnson, played by Anthony Mackie. They both get confronted by a bunch of racist assholes. Those people then have to learn the hard way that they're too weak against our heroes. That being said, however, it still led them to jail. Mary Todd then helps our two heroes to get out of prison. You can consider yourself a lucky man, Abe, for having a girl by his side who's just as beautiful at heart as she is with her looks. That night eventually motivated Abe to dedicate his life to fight against the prejudice and injustice that occurred at his day of age. The speech itself, while short, manages to be very uplifting thanks to its sincere nature. Have a listen.
We may only shatter the tranquil veil of oppression, but we must not be deterred. For ours is a just and noble cause. The cause of freedom, the very cause upon which our founding fathers built this great nation.
Abe then takes the offer to get himself into politics. He then meets Henry again and demands to get his chance to finally kill Jack Bartz. Henry then gives in and allows him to fight Bartz, but he also tells him to be careful since Bartz also knows about Mary. What follows is one of the most insanely awesome action scenes I've ever seen in my life. Seriously, Abe is chasing Bartz doing a horse stampede. Our hero is running in between those horses to catch Bartz. The latter even throws 2 freaking horses at him, and it would eventually lead to them both jumping on different horses to fight each other. Not only is this my favorite part of this film, but it's also one of the most inventive action scenes ever put on screen. And yet, there are still people that don't care about this film. Just, what the hell? Abe eventually gets the upper hand, but before he can avenge his mother, he gets told by Bartz that when he dies, that there are more vampires to come, and he also reveals that Henry is a vampire too. We then cut to a prostitute who's about to get raped by an asshole who's ignorant about the law of prostitute limitations, like if they, for example, are not paying them. And to all those who say that prostitutes don't have limits, please do me a favor and go die a painful death. That lady then gets saved by Henry, but much to his horror, it all happens in front of Abe's eyes. This then leads to Henry telling his origins on how he became a vampire. He and his wife got cornered by Adam and his army of vampires. Henry tried to fight them off, but with no success. His wife even tried to intervene, but it was all for nothing. Henry slowly turned into a vampire while being forced to watch his wife getting sucked out to death. As great as this movie is, this scene sadly has one unintentionally funny moment in it. You see, during the moment where Henry slowly turns into a vampire, he has that look on his face that makes him look like he's intoxicated or something. It's not that it's poorly acted, but I think it would have benefited the scene much better if they've just kept the shot of Henry's wife slowly dying for much longer, while showing Henry's transformation after seeing her dying. Otherwise, it just feels all over the place. Aside from that though, it still works on a dramatic standpoint because within the context, the backstory is still incredibly tragic. And the fact that Adam even went so far to kill Henry's wife, with the latter not being able to join her in death, well, that makes me feel incredibly sorry for this poor guy. What is even worse, however, is that Henry can't even avenge the death of his wife because vampires in this universe are unable to kill their own kind. It's really heartbreaking, and it gives you an idea how incredibly ruthless this movie's antagonist is. Abe then abandons Henry. After arriving back home, he gets confronted by Mary Todd, who wonders what Abe is hiding from her. Abe then reveals his secret to her. But it's not the confession that you would expect.
Mary Todd, will you make me the happiest of men?
What I really like a lot about this scene, aside from being incredibly sweet, is that in most movies, guys would usually try to hide their marriage plans. But in this movie, Abe is trying to hide his vampire hunting job by asking her to marry him. This movie manages to add new ways to play with our expectations with unique ideas and subversions. God, I love this movie. Unfortunately, Abe received an invitation that implies that his close best friend William is about to get killed along with some black slaves by the vampire army. Abe and Joshua then arrive there, and we then get a quick backstory about how Adam has been a vampire for centuries before the Bible has been involved in a previous movie I've reviewed. This then sadly leads to another flaw that this movie has. Adam's origin story sounds pretty cool, but, well, let's just say that the climax of this movie has a rather lackluster payoff that doesn't quite live up to its intimidating reputation. One thing this origin scene has going for it though is that the portrait visuals are freaking awesome. Adam and Vadoma then get the upper hand, and as it looks like William is about to get killed, our dear Joshua saves our two heroes with him literally crashing into the party. Badass! Our heroes also save some of the other slaves that had survived this event, and they all get away from Adam and his army. The horror scenario eventually led to Abe to focus more on his plans to get rid of slavery for good, which means that he won't do any vampire hunting anymore, much to Henry's dismay.
Henry only saw the struggle his way, but I began at last to see it another. To see and to feel the even greater issues at stake. So he and I would go our separate ways. As the Bible says, the time had come for me to put aside childish things.
Cut to years later. Abe has now become the President of the United States, with him sporting his iconic looks that we all know and love him for, while walking out for a badass entry. Also, the makeup that this movie uses to make Abraham Lincoln look older is just awesome. Yes, that's still the same actor. It's still Benjamin Walker playing an older Lincoln. He just looks like the real deal. And next to that comes that our dear Benjamin also gives Abe a deeper voice from this point on. This movie puts true love into the details. You know, you can love or hate this film, but to say that there was no effort put into it would be a huge freaking lie. Abe tries to live his presidential time in peace, alongside with his wife and children. Or maybe it's just one child. They both had 4 children in real life, but this movie leaves it ambiguous. Though, considering the scene that we're about to witness, it may just be for the best. If only for drama's sake. Abe and Mary's son Willie sadly suffers from a slow, painful death thanks to Vodoma. Henry arrives at Abe's place to send his condolences, while also trying to convince him to fight back against Adam. Mary eventually figures out about Abe's former vampire hunting business thanks to his journal she stole from him, and she even demands from Henry to help bringing their son back to life. But both of our heroes inform her that by turning Willie into a vampire, that he wouldn't be the same anymore. And if anyone has ever seen Interview with a Vampire, then you know how messed up vampire-turned children can become over time.
You're asking me to trust you. After you lied to me for all these years?
I did it to protect you, to protect our family.
And how did that work out? You took this, Abe! You took this! You brought this on him! You brought this on our boy!
I feel real sad for poor Mary because even though we know that Abe and Henry are right with what they're saying, losing a loved one is always tragic, especially if we talk about their own children. Mary Elizabeth Winstead really pulls off a great acting performance here. Abe falls into an emotional low point where he doesn't know how to win the Civil War, as he's guilt-ridden about the death of his own son. During the dinner with Mary, he comes to the idea to use bullets and weapons made out of silver. Getting said weapons past the vampires, on the other hand, will be a tough mission. Before that, however, we see Abe apologizing to Mary for keeping his secondary job as a secret for all those years. Though, considering that Mary didn't believe Abe the first time he told her about it, it's not hard to blame her for not saying anything afterwards. This then leads to a nice moment between those two.
I need you, Mary.
I've waited a long time to hear you say those words.
Abe then pulls out a silver axe to go up against Adam and his army for one more time. It also leads to an amusing moment. Remember when I've said that the quirky good-natured moments work pretty well humor-wise? Well, what I mean by that is that if done in a small doses, in a very subtle way, then some of the more humorous moments are downright hilarious because they're incredibly surprising. Like you're not seeing it coming. That's exactly what makes it great. That actually adds to some great humor. Though it's pretty hard to pull off. It's not really easy because you have to make it work without coming off as too out of place. But this movie manages to pull it off.
This war ends tonight. It's time we had a nation of our own.
You know, maybe it's just me, but every time I come across a plot where vampires are trying to create their own nation, or hell, try to build their own world dominated by their own kind, that this has to be like one of the most asinine plans that they could ever come up with. I mean, think about it. Vampires need human blood to quench their thirst. But let's just say that humans would become extinct thanks to the overpopulation of vampires. What would come next? Would they suffer from a never-ending thirst for blood? Would they have to convert to animal blood like in the movie Interview with a Vampire? Would they have to suck each other out, or is their own blood too poisonous? Maybe they would open up their own human farm, but even that seems to be a flawed idea considering how long it takes for humans to give birth and how they would have to wait for years until they become full-grown, rich-bleeding adults. Having a villain with a flawed plan is not all too much bad though. Quite the opposite even. It makes it easier for us to root for the heroes, and really, you should never sympathize too much with their motives, well-intentioned or not. The only way you could make it work is if the movie finds out the good bits in between a flawed plan, like with the ideas that Killmonger had in mind in Black Panther. Abe and company then plan on how to hide the weapons from the vampires, which then cuts to a locomotive with Abe, William, Joshua and Henry inside. The vampires catch up to them, and Henry tells Abe that Joshua is most likely behind that, but Abe ignores Henry's words. This then leads to a huge series of vampire slaughtering, where everyone is able to show off their badassery. William kicks ass, even after barely avoiding death. Abe showcases that he hasn't lost his touch, and as it looks like Adam is about to turn Abe into a vampire, Henry manages to save him at the right second. And what I really love about this shot is on how it manages to play with our expectations again. At first it looks like Abe is about to get bitten, but then the movie says, nope, it's Henry to the rescue. Adam manages to get back inside the locomotive with our heroes fighting off the other vampires again. Here's the next funny moment. Also, Abe was a football player. Who would have guessed? Though that touchdown kick of yours needs some practice there, pal. Adam then gets inside the wagon full of boxes. And even though it looks like Henry was right about Joshua being a traitor, it turns out that Adam got out-gambited by our heroes.
Lincoln set us up. We've been tricked, Adam.
The fight ain't over yet though. Vadoma burns down the bridge the locomotive is about to reach, Adam kills Joshua for the latter's undying loyalty to our heroes, and the fight on the roof of each wagon ends up being insanely awesome again, as our heroes are fighting Adam while also jumping over several other wagons. And the climax against Adam finally occurs on a slowly collapsing bridge.
There's nowhere left to run, Lincoln. Where is it? Where's the silver? Right here!
You know, for all the awesome fighting we've previously witnessed, I gotta say that the end fight against Adam just feels very anticlimactic. I mean, as awesomely shot as the silver clock stabbing was, it still felt very disappointing in comparison to everything else. You would also expect for a vampire, who's over 5,000 years old, to provide a much tougher fight for our titular hero. Anyway, the locomotive is about to crash down the bridge, but they all get saved by Henry at the last second. Mary comes across Vadoma, and she lets her inner mama lying out by killing Vadoma with the silver toy of her son. The army of Abe manages to beat the vampire army thanks to the silver weapons, thus winning the Civil War, and Abe then holds a speech for all the brave warriors that fought the good fight, while honoring the ones that sacrificed their lives.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Abe then caps off the rest of the events in his journal and is about to attend the Ford's Theater. Henry pleads Abe to become a vampire too, so that they can both fight side by side against the threats around the world. Abe declines his offer because, as he puts it,
vampires are not the only things that live forever.
So he hands his journal to Henry, puts on his top hat, and leaves the White House with Mary by his side. And even though we all know what is going to happen in this theater, his legacy shall forever live on to this very day. Cut to a modern day Washington. We are back at a bar, just like with Abe and Henry at the beginning. We see a guy who gets himself drunk. Henry sits next to that man, and the circle repeats itself.
A guy only gets that drunk when he wants to kiss a girl or kill a man. So which is it?
Thus ending this movie on a decent note. And to top it all off, we get an awesome song by Linkin Park at the end credits. I don't feel one bit ashamed to say that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter is a freaking awesome movie. The action scenes are amazing, and at certain parts incredibly unique. The acting is pretty solid, with some heavy vampires thrown at us, and Benjamin Walker as Abe Lincoln deserves special mention, thanks to pouring his heart into his performance, and I hope that maybe someday he'll get a chance to shine on the silver screen again. The villains are a bit wasted with some questionable motives, but you just love to hate them. The effects are mostly pretty good, and I've barely noticed anything wrong with them, except for maybe anytime the vampires open up their mouths. Otherwise, it still looks great. And for all the criticism that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter has received, like that this movie apparently takes itself too seriously, I really don't understand what people mean by that. Yes, this movie takes itself seriously, but it still has humorous moments in there. It's just that they're more subtle and oftentimes dry in nature. But honestly, I really love the style that Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter has, and I think this movie couldn't have worked if it was purely comedic. For example, the whole movie is set at an age and time where the whole slavery conflict was still in full effect. It would have been pretty tough to throw in lots of jokes in there without coming off as too offensive. Special praise has to go to the fact that this movie portrays William Johnson in a dignified manner. They almost never drew any attention to his skin color. If Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was more comedy-like, then this movie probably would have turned William into a token black guy who would talk with a hip-hop slang while constantly dropping the N-word over and over again.
We taking your money and buying your bitches with your money. That's right. Come get some, motherfucker.
Ugh. Thank God that didn't happen. This movie's overall execution could easily be compared to classic parody movies like the Airplane duology or anything that Mel Brooks has ever done. You got characters acting dead seriously in a world full of absurdity. It's not as laughing out loud funny as those classics I've mentioned, but the more surreal parts in this comically serious movie manage to be real funny due to how unexpected those moments are. Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter also manages to have a biopic feel to it, which is truly fascinating considering that this film obviously doesn't even try to be realistic, and yet it manages to be respectful to historic events while still being about a vampire hunting president. That's a true act of talent. This movie was based on the novel with the same name, and this flick was actually written by the same author. Talk about being respectful to the source material. This is not something you hear really often with big budget movies. You also get to give the author, Seth Graham Smith, major props for writing the script based on his own book without being overfilled with exposition. A tough task to accomplish if it comes to most novel-based adaptations, especially for an author. If you went inside this film to expect a movie like Lincoln, then that's your own fault. For the record, I think that Steven Spielberg's Lincoln is a solid biopic, which is as accurate as a movie can get, but just like real life, it can get real boring at times. I'll take a film with a fictionalized president fighting against vampires over a flick that is as boring as life itself any day. I hope you enjoyed this review, and at last I gotta say, I may be unfunny, but my points are still valid.